Cool. So yes, I recognize lots of names. It's good to see everybody. So thanks for being here on a Tuesday. I'm not solo on this tonight, although my fellow FWP staff, I'm sure, are muted. I know Emily Olmberg is on the phone. I think maybe is on. And then there's someone else who I don't recognize, but I recognize a number. So thanks for those guys. And maybe if there's questions at the end that I can't answer, they can help. So yeah, this has been a few interesting months. Ian was just asking how much this has changed my world here. And, you know, shy of kind of having to rearrange some field work or cancel some field work where we had groups of people going out. The big thing has been thinking about bats and potential risk to bats. And to some extent, what's going to happen in terms of public perception. You know, the minute I heard the news that COVID-19 was probably going to be blamed on bats, I just thought, oh my gosh, how can they take one more thing? But it's not necessarily surprising either. So we're just going to run through some of that tonight, and hopefully there'll be lots of time for questions. So title, bats and SARS-CoV-2, everybody I think you guys are a super smart group. So as I worked through this today, I tried to keep in mind that many of you may have actually read more on this than I have. So forgive me if I go too basic. SARS coronavirus 2 is the virus that's actually causing coronavirus. So this is similar a little bit to white nose syndrome. We say white nose syndrome, but it's actually caused by a fungus, which is that big long pseudogenoascus thing. So coronavirus is what we're going to be talking about. We're talking about bats, and oh no, I can't go forward. I'm not advancing. I was advancing earlier, Ellen.
I don't know why. Sometimes Zoom, it gets stuck. Sometimes you have to physically click it instead of using your keyboard, or give it a second. I don't know why it does that.
Okay, so that's my first joke of the night. These little meme things that I found today were really great. There's so much online. If you just type in COVID and bat cartoons, there's tons of them. So that's my first one. We're talking about bats. How did this all begin? Bats, as everybody knows, carry tons of pathogens. They are responsible in part for all these listed up here, these big scary ones like Ebola and Hendra and Marburg and things we hear about in the news. They rarely fall ill or die from it, or at least they don't show obvious symptoms most times. Scientists have suspected that for some reason, bats have got this strange sort of agreement with these viruses, and they've kind of figured out a way to survive with them. So that puts them in this role of host or vector for a lot of these things that can kind of spill over to humans. So how do they survive? Raina Plowright, who's on the bottom of this screen here, is actually a disease ecologist from Montana State University. She's done a lot of work on bats and coronaviruses, so we're super fortunate to have her in Montana. But some of the work that she's done has said, you know, basically bats are just amazing little creatures who can go up in metabolism rate to 15 times their resting state for sometimes prolonged periods, and they have really sophisticated ways of repairing the cells that they need to do all of the crazy work that they do. So unlike us, they just have this really unique ability to repair after some sort of stress. And so that may be the same way they deal with some of these viruses. They're, you know, basically superheroes of immunity because they're constantly fighting off these viruses that they have, because they carry lots of coronaviruses as well as lots of other things. And so they're just constantly fighting the viral life cycle off and the negative impacts of any sort of virus that would hit us pretty hard. So I like this quote today. They've hit an immunological sweet spot where they are mounting a response that keeps invaders at bay without causing unnecessary harm to their own bodies. So you guys are all following the news, but there's a lot of new scary information, particularly about kids, that the immune responses and the inflammatory responses are super high and super scary and super dangerous. Bats have somehow avoided that for the most part, and that's no doubt over millions and millions of years of evolution, or, you know, however long they've been around. So again, I said North American bats are known to have coronaviruses. All bats have coronaviruses. We know that our bats have alpha coronaviruses. They do not currently, to our knowledge, have non-SARS. Beta I think that should say SARS beta coronaviruses. Anyways, they don't have the dangerous one that we're talking about today. And what we do know from the research that's available, and keep in mind that all of this is an evolving science. So all of the stuff I'm going to talk about today some of it at least could change tomorrow based on laboratory studies or further research, and people are scrambling right now to work on bats and to work on this virus. But it appears that the different branches of the family tree of bats have very different viruses. And so some work has been done to sequence those viruses. And they found that, bats in Myanmar and bats in South America and bats in North America, they have very different sorts of viral makeups, if you will. And then we go to Ebola, we go to Hendra, we go to coronavirus in our mind, and we think, it's always the bats. And so bats get blamed for a lot of these pretty serious human diseases. And it could be in part that while, yes, they are host to a lot of these zoonoses, then more so than other mammals, sometimes we just aren't looking elsewhere. So of course, we're going to go look at the bats first for some of these things because we haven't looked anywhere else, and it's likely that maybe they are responsible. So certainly some more study of other species would be nice. So I mentioned the family tree. I looked at a whole bunch of these family trees today, and they get really complicated really fast, but this is a really basic one. And what it demonstrates is that our North American bats are way up there at the top of this tree, and the bats responsible for this most recent zoonosis is way down here at the bottom. And so remember, I said the different families often have different viruses. And so one could guess that maybe the bats of the Americas are safe from these viruses that the bats, the horseshoe bat in Asia has. Unknown exactly, but it looks likely that maybe our North American bats are not capable of getting this one that we're talking about. But again, time will tell on some of this. So let's talk about zoonotics. You guys, again, are well-read and super informed people. So you know that zoonotics are just diseases that are jumping from wildlife to humans, which is exactly what's happened in this case of COVID-19. Keep in mind, though, that it goes both ways, and there's fancy names, I can't even say it. There's zoonoses, and there's other names for things when they go from humans to wildlife, but in general, these diseases that go from wildlife to humans or back and forth are called zoonotic diseases. So again, can go either or and or both ways. So I was thinking last night as I was working on this that it's been a long, long time since I read Spillover by David Quammen, and I bet a lot of you on the phone have read it. But at the end of chapter 2, there's this phrase that I always remember whenever bats come out as the bad guys. And I couldn't look at the book today because I've loaned it out, but I think it's about Hendra virus. And at the very end of the chapter, it says, "That's it. That's the bloody tree." And then they go on to say that's where the bats gathered. And that was a tree, I believe, over a place where a horse used to stand. The horse was responsible for transmitting the disease. I think it was Hendra to humans. Regardless of all those details, there's been a lot of information out there and a lot of discussion about these spillover diseases in the last couple of decades. And I'll touch on the movie again in a little while, but Contagion, a movie I haven't actually seen. But if you watch the trailer of that today, even if you haven't seen the movie, it is pretty predictive of what we're actually going through. Okay, so just a quick comment to try not to vilify bats too much. Part of the reason some of these viruses do hop over to humans is because we've encroached into their territory. And so in a lot of cases, bats carry these viruses, or other species carry these viruses and go about their business and are perfectly healthy in their own right. But the minute we stress them, those viruses multiply, and sometimes that's when animals shed them. And so it's rare that a virus or some sort of disease is going to cross from a wildlife species to a human, because we're not really very common in terms of our genetic makeup. But in these extreme situations where we have super stressed wildlife, then that's when we tend to see these spillover events. And I just wanted to highlight another ecologist here who I don't know at Montana State University. He's quoted in some of these papers, and his saying is, when we charge into these wild spaces, we put ourselves in harm's way. So just talking about disease transmission, this is one of the things that I've learned a little bit about in the last few months, and it's partly what we'll talk about later, but to be clear, there's exposure, and that's the likelihood a particular interaction between an animal and a human will result in some sort of sharing of the virus. So everyone's used to now this idea of, you know, a symptomatic person coughing, and that means they're shedding the virus and out into the atmosphere. That would be an exposure. And then an infection is actually if someone else takes that into their system and that virus replicates, and typically then that's when someone has a negative reaction because they've been infected. So it's likely that, like other outbreaks, which is the 2002 SARS outbreak, that coronavirus didn't necessarily come directly from bats to humans. In the SARS outbreak, it went from bats to cat-like civets before infecting humans. And then in this one, they're suspecting or speculating that it was horseshoe bats again to pangolins to humans. The pangolins are those little cutie pantses that kind of look like anteaters that have scales that are apparently valuable for some sort of remedy or some sort of magic one way or another. Okay, so I want to just put this up again to remind everybody it goes both ways. I think when people think of zoonotic diseases, they always assume it goes wildlife to humans. It can go the other direction, which is why this is important to us right now. We probably wouldn't be having this discussion if we had confirmed North American bats don't have these dangerous coronaviruses. We as humans are safe. What we're actually concerned about is transferring the coronavirus back to our North American bats. So it's kind of the opposite of what we've been mostly hearing about. Like I said, I have not seen the movie Contagion, but I hope that anybody that has recognizes this little clip and knows what it means. But it is really fascinating. If you get online and you type in Contagion, the movie, you come up with a whole bunch of articles where they're comparing how that movie was laid out to what's actually happening today. And this picture right here is showing just a perfect scenario where Gwyneth Paltrow is apparently the first infected human with this virus that they made up. And I think she's blowing on a poker chip. And of course, that would be putting a whole bunch of respiratory droplets out in the environment that someone else could pick up. Unknowing kind of asymptomatic people can also shed the virus for weeks. So this is kind of a perfect situation for those of you on the phone who have been with us or have conducted some sort of bat research. This could look like you trying to figure out the reproductive status of a bat. So we are constantly blowing on things that we have in our hand, be it a songbird or be it a bat, which has really raised the alarm of certain individuals, of the community, I should say, that we are constantly exposing critters to anything that we might have in our system. The other thing to note is that at least the current research shows that respiratory droplets and the virus within those can live for hours within an enclosed space. And those enclosed spaces could be an attic, it could be a captive wildlife facility, but it could also be a place like a cave. So in places where there's not ventilation, we have great concern that the virus could actually persist for some amount of time. Okay, so really quickly after this all went down and we all got sent home, the USGS and US Fish and Wildlife Service assembled a team to get together and look at the risk of transmission from humans to bats. So these are the people who aren't necessarily in the human health world, but they are the folks who work on white nose syndrome. They're the folks who think about bat conservation, and they quickly recognize that there could be a significant risk to North American bats, which we consider to be a naive population to this particular virus. And that risk would be from us as researchers, as people who go out and monitor bats in caves, perhaps. There's also a risk from a group that does bat pest control. So if you think about wildlife control operators who might find themselves in an attic, if they don't have appropriate respiratory protection or they don't have appropriate ventilation, if they are shedding the virus and that persists in that environment, the bats could pick it up that way. And then of course there's bat rehabilitation, which is not allowed in Montana, but it is surprisingly allowed in a whole lot of other places. And so you have folks in very, very close proximity for sometimes long periods of time with bats. So you could have an asymptomatic rehabilitator with all the best intentions of the world who sheds virus onto these animals as they work with them, get them back up to whatever state they need to be in to be released. And if there was a transmission there, they would potentially send that bat back out into the world with a new virus. The one thing the evaluation did not look at, and I asked this very specifically, is the risk of transmission from the general public or recreational cavers. Recreational cavers was my specific question, and I think the group just didn't think that they were the highest risk category to evaluate at the time. And again, this was all done very, very quickly. But the other risk that wasn't really looked at is the general public. So if you have a bat, let's say in your house, let's say you are an asymptomatic individual, you are shedding the virus in your environment, you find the bat in your house, you don't believe it's bit anybody, you open your window and you could have potentially sent the bat back out into the environment, again, carrying a new virus. There are some states who are very much behind this being the real risk. How we could address this is tricky and complicated, but I spoke with someone from Texas today who said, you know, we believe that we have so much human interaction with our bats that we couldn't ever get a handle on, that our own research and monitoring or rehab or pest control probably doesn't really matter, because if it's going to get out there, it may come from one of these sorts of situations. Okay, so this came out today. The findings of the risk assessment have been kind of floating around for a couple weeks, but the findings actually came out today in published form. And so Ellen, I will send that to you. I think you asked for it, and I can send it out to the group. It's a pretty long document, and it's based almost entirely on assumptions and uncertainties. So it's tricky in that way. Basically, a group of experts got together. They talked about what they thought the highest risk situations were. They made a bunch of assumptions on whether North American bats are susceptible and how they might, you know, react to a new novel virus. And through a whole bunch of iterations and modeling and magic, they came up and said, a researcher like myself shedding a virus with standard protocols, and that would be, we typically wear gloves. I can't think of a time where I've worn a mask when I've handled a bat, and I do not typically wear a Tyvek suit. So standard protocols of just gloves, I could expose 50% of the bats that I handled, and I could infect 17%. Now, keep in mind that that may seem like a small amount. It actually seems like a pretty big risk of exposure to me, and maybe a smaller risk of infection, but we're talking about bats who don't have any exposure to this potential virus, and we don't really know or have any idea what the mortality rate could be following exposure to a new virus. They may just suck it into their little system and do just fine with it like they do many other viruses. They may not, since it's something new. One big risk is they could suck it into their little systems and fly around and be happy and exchange it with one another. But the next time we go into a cave, let's say Ellen hasn't been exposed and she's not around anyone who's been exposed, but she goes into a cave, she contracts the virus, she takes it home, and we kind of start a whole nother epidemic or pandemic, if you will, because we've established a new reservoir host in North America. Okay, so the highest risk group, not surprising, rehabilitation activities. And I didn't put all the numbers in here. I'll tell you one reason I didn't is because the confidence intervals around some of this stuff they're crazy. You know, 8 to 88 is the confidence interval out of 100 for some of these things. And again, it's because it's based on uncertainty and assumptions. It's kind of the best thing we've got right now. And it certainly can be adjusted and refined as we have more information. So rehabilitation activities, you're handling bats maybe multiple times a day, they're in your house. You know, some folks have said biosecurity protocols are pretty loose when someone is conducting rehabilitation in their back bedroom or maybe their laundry room. So I agree, these are relatively dangerous situations if we want to talk about disease transmission. Medium risk is the research and monitoring. Lowest but still non-negligible is the wildlife control operators. In large part, wildlife control operators are wearing protective equipment anyways. I can't tell you that for certain 100% of the time, but they are often walking into places where there's lots of poop from one thing or another, and maybe it's hot and maybe it's stinky, and they're generally trying to protect themselves. The interesting thing is using adequate personal protective equipment reduces the risk of all this transmission by over 90%. Now, keep in mind that adequate personal protective equipment involves a mask that's actually been fitted appropriately. It also has to be a mask that doesn't allow exhalation particles out of the mask. So the thing that many folks are worried about right now is making sure that they don't get germs coming into their mask. This is the exact opposite. So we want to make sure that our germs are not going out of our mask. So doing so with gloves and the right clothing and decontaminating between sites should increase or decrease the risk significantly of us giving bats any sort of shed virus from us. Again, I mentioned the uncertainties. There's a lot. They only considered one species, and that was a little brown bat, and they did that because it's generally got a wide distribution. It's kind of known everywhere. They only considered transmission during the active season. This was problematic for me because they really looked at May through November. So the whole idea of transmitting shed virus to bats during a hibernation period wasn't considered at all. We have no idea what the transmission probability is from bat to bat. We don't really know what the virus shedding rate is from asymptomatic people. I was kind of terrified to know you could be asymptomatic for weeks and you could shed the virus that entire time. So that's problematic for any of us at home or at work, but it's also problematic for wildlife. And then I mentioned the unknown levels of interaction between bats and the general public. We don't know how many people interact with bats that we have no idea, we never hear about. And then, of course, the big question is we don't even know if they're susceptible to this virus. They may not, there may be impacts, there may not be. So all of these uncertainties and unknowns are kind of wrapped in here. So recommendations for everybody, this appropriate PPE, something is better than nothing. We have folks out doing work right now, and I've said, you know, if you find yourself in an enclosed space with bats, make sure you've got some kind of mask. Maybe you could double up, be extra careful. Strong biosecurity practices. We don't have a lot of lab work or anything that we do here, but there certainly are some places where that might be appropriate. Decontamination, which you guys have already nailed. You've got this in your general practice, but for a wildlife pest control operator, it's really important that he or she is not taking the virus from one place to another if it happens to be there, or if he or she happens to be carrying it. So decontamination is a big one. Rehabilitation is one that's been a big topic. There's kind of two edges of the discussion. There's, if the public picks up a bat, they make a phone call and they can't find anybody that's going to take it and it's injured, they're probably going to let it go. And then again, we don't have that bat for sampling. They may never talk to us again. We don't know what that sort of interaction is. In our case, I think generally the Montana public is relatively comfortable that we do not rehabilitate bats, and we have a long list of reasons why. But certainly taking those bats from those individuals for euthanasia is a better option than just having them hang up the phone and walk away. And this is my cute pangolin picture because I haven't had a picture for a while. There are lots of nuances to this discussion, and Emily Almberg, our disease ecologist, and I, and Raina Plowright from MSU and others had some lengthy discussions on the phone trying to make some decisions about our own work. Should we trap? Should we not trap? What does the public want us to do? And one of the interesting things that's happened across the states is anybody who is planning to conduct any wildlife work with masks on their faces has had to ask themselves, is the public going to be upset with me that I have a mask that could be used by somebody else? And I'm not talking about the masks that you can make at home. We're talking about the N95 masks. So we have to be sensitive that we don't want to be taking equipment from human health needs. So that's been a big one for a lot of folks, and maybe not so much here in Montana, but we had to think about it. Some bat work is inherently dangerous. I didn't see Zach on the conference, but I think he was a little heartbroken when I said, gosh, I really want to go to Azure Cave too. But based on these unknowns of transmission and the fact that we could have an accident in there and we could need emergency responders, we really have been encouraged to not do that sort of work. Again, not such a big deal in Montana, but certainly other places. We had to weigh the risk of not knowing if we had white nose syndrome this year versus maybe risking transmission to bats by going out and sampling. We don't have a lot of strong response actions for a positive white nose syndrome detection, so that factored into the risk of us being out there handling bats. And then every decision we're talking about here and that the national or worldwide community has had to make is just a mix of conservation and human health objectives. And there's going to be trade-offs all across the board. So everyone has been in this discussion of, should we do this? Is it dangerous? Is it better? It's been a long, long discussion. So with that said, public perception over the use of appropriate PPE was a concern, a lot of unknowns. The small risk but potentially disastrous results is an important concept that really stuck with me. Yeah, our risk of transmitting virus to our bats is probably pretty small. And I feel great today, so I'm probably not shedding the virus. But let's say I was and I blew on a bunch of bats and I transmit a virus that they are not used to and they cannot handle, or they establish within a North American population. So too risky based on what we actually know right now. So we canceled capture. I don't know, I guess that was the end of March that we canceled capture and we haven't opened that back up. My understanding, most states are in that same place. I know Texas is allowing some capture. There's some capture going on in other parts of the world. For our purposes of why we need to handle bats right now, it didn't seem that critical. Certainly there are research projects going on right now where it's a big deal to miss a year or 6 months, and those folks are maybe doing it, but they're taking every possible precaution they can. There are increased restrictions at Lewis and Clark Caverns. It's still open for visitation. I think Ria's on the phone, so she can correct me when we open up the lines, but decreased capacity on the tours. They are bleaching handrails. They're being super careful, and I think they're staying out of the areas where they actually know they'll encounter bats. I don't think I say this in the next slide. Just a quick web search did reveal today that some public caves are closed, and they are saying it's because of their concerns for bats. Some are closed based on their concerns of an inability to honor social distancing rules. So you guys know better than I kind of what's open or closed right now and for what reasons. So we are conducting white nose syndrome surveillance through guano sampling. It is less than ideal. It's always been an option, but it's really much less effective than actually having bats in hand. So our biologists and some from other agencies are out right now collecting guano at bridge or maybe barn sites, and then they submit that sample. And if there's a strong, signature of the fungus that causes white nose syndrome, it will be picked up. We could lift our prohibition on bat capture at any time, and again, it depends on a lot of things. Rain and Plow right now, one of our discussions said, maybe by next Christmas we'll all be vaccinated and you can go about your business and do whatever. That all still has to be seen. We sent a letter to wildlife control operators. They had been alerted by their kind of national support group that they should be extra careful right now. That communication was to protect the human side of their work. We sent them a note just saying there's another thing here, and that thing is that we don't want you to transmit virus that you may have to bats. That letter went out last week. I haven't heard anything back on that, and we have no intention of opening rehabilitation of bats in Montana anytime soon. That's in part because they're considered a rabies or a disease vector by Department of Health and Human Services, so it would take legislative action to change that and give us really the authority to open rehabilitation. Ooh, okay, and I made it. So that's all I have for the formal presentation. I know Emily at least was on the phone, and maybe Ria and maybe somebody else, but I'm happy to hear from you guys too as to what you know, and we'll just open it up there, Ellen. Thanks for the opportunity, guys.
Sounds good. Thanks, Lauri. We really appreciate having partners of people like you who can come and talk to us about these things. So yeah, if anybody has a question, I'd encourage you to type it into the chat or raise your hand or whatever you need to do. And I think Lauri, if you stop sharing the screen first, people will have an easier time. I think it interferes sometimes.
Okay, there you are. I should note that there's some Wyoming folks on the phone too. They may have something to add. Besides you, Ellen.
yeah, I have nothing to add. I guess, yeah, we do have a small group, so I could also give people the option to unmute themselves if they are too shy for the chat. Let me hang on just a second. Oops. Okay, folks, you do have the opportunity to unmute yourselves. Our first question is, who do we call if a house has a bat?
So we're kind of operating under the same rules here as we have been in the past. If there's been any potential human exposure or there's not assurance that there hasn't been, so if there's a child in the house, if there's a disabled person in the house that can't adequately answer the question, do you think you may have been bit or was the bat in your room? And it should be taken to the county for rabies test. We haven't, it's a good question. We haven't thought about any additional sort of testing or analysis based on that issue that I threw out there. You could have a bat in your house. You could let it go. That's a human exposure, the opposite way of what we usually think of, that you could have exposed the bat to something. I don't know if anyone is doing anything different there. It's something maybe we should consider. And again, maybe because it wasn't included in the risk assessment, there's been no one thinking about processing that different. It could go badly for the bats if we said every one of those bats has to be tested. We could institute a system where people are asked, has anyone been in the house that's been sick? I can't imagine it's not going to come up in the eastern states where there are so many positive cases that someone in the house who's been recently ill or exposed, finds a bat. I guess I'm maybe passing the buck and hoping that those eastern states or folks where there's just a lot more human population is going to help us answer that. Because as it stands right now, I would provide the same advice that we normally do. The county won't test it unless there's been a human exposure. We can certainly pick it up from you and euthanize it. Lots of people like the option of just shooing it out of the house.
Thanks for that. Next question is, what precautions would you recommend for emergence counts, if any?
Yeah, so Julia, the only recommendations I've seen for emergence counts is for human health protection. So if you have to stand next to someone not in your immediate circle, in a tight space because you have to, it's a cave and you have to stand in this little confined space next to someone, then that's being discouraged. So that's a social distancing thing from a human perspective. As long as there's ventilation, so if you are standing outside of Azure and you're simply doing it coming out, there shouldn't be any risk to the bats or humans there. So the only advice again is just human social distancing has been mentioned in different places. And we talked about that with Azure Cave Vernacula, that because we can't get in there this year, it would have been nice to get in there and do some emergence counts just from outside the gate. And we couldn't rally our troops enough to get that done early enough, but that might be something we consider down the road.
James typed in a question there. And again, folks, if you want to unmute yourself and ask, you are welcome to. He asked, humans are susceptible to a number of coronaviruses. Have any of these been transferred to North American bats?
I was just going to suggest we turn James off because I have no idea, but somebody else. The diseases that I could find today that go the other way were not coronaviruses. It's hard to say because there's a whole bunch of them. You know, there's as many coronaviruses as there are bat species across the world. It's 13 or 1400. There's a porcine coronavirus and there's a bovine coronavirus. The things that are most notable for us to have transmitted back to wildlife are things, there's a lot of parasites, E. coli, Giardia that we kind of give back to wildlife, but I didn't see anything about specific coronaviruses. So it's a good question, James. I'll see if I can find an answer.
Yeah, it's definitely an interesting question, especially considering how many folks have probably gone caving with a common cold or stuff like that that we never thought about in the past, at least as far as risk to bats. And then a question from Claire: what are the precautions or restrictions for Lewis and Clark Caverns and public visitation this summer?
So this is Rhea from Lewis and Clark Caverns. I'm the manager there. And we started off with just going through the lower portion of the cave. It's the exit. It's not as common to see a bat there, especially in the summer. They usually hang out at the entrance. And the restrictions are basically that whatever we do for humans also helps bats. So we're requiring that every visitor wear a mask for the entire time that they're in the cave. And we are using bleach, a weak solution, to clean the handrails every single trip into the cave. And by restricting it to 9, and then it goes up to 10 with phase 2, is all of the numbers that we can safely distance in the cave. So it's the 2 biggest rooms. There is some natural airflow in that. And then again, with the masks and the cleaning from everywhere we touch, pretty much I'm worried about it, you know, could it come to my staff? And everything I've done for my staff is actually something that would help the bats. In talking to Lauri, the one concern I had was we had used a bleach solution to clean off some of the algae on the formations before. The lights kind of encouraged that, the old lights that were not LED. And I worried that the more exposure, and because it was so far away, we thought that it would be all right. And the other idea being that if they don't like the smell, they could leave conceivably and find a spot and come back. So is that answering that question?
Looks like you got it.
So it looks like Emily, she said this privately. So Emily Almberg, disease ecologist from our lab, says, I don't know if anyone knows about past transmission of other coronaviruses from humans to bats. So maybe I should assign that to Emily to look into. Probably has better resources than I do.
I can try and do that.
So Lauri, I guess I would just ask, is there any takeaway yet as far as cavers and bats? It sounds like recreational caving has not really been addressed as any kind of risk assessment. You know, is there any kind of thought that cavers should maybe be wearing masks if they're in a room with a bat, in a cave room with a bat, something like that? I mean, basically there's just not much guidance at this point.
There's not a lot of guidance, and that was something that I think, because it's so pertinent to us in Montana, that I was struggling with the idea that they weren't looking into that. But again, I just think there's so many moving pieces. They kind of went for the lowest hanging fruit, or maybe the most risky situations. If it was up to me right now and I was going into a cave where I knew there was going to be bats, I certainly would wear a mask. I mean, there's a reason we chose not to go into Azure, although with white nose syndrome now 30 miles east of the Montana border, you know, we really wanted to get into Azure this year. The National Health Lab really wanted us to get into Azure and sample those bats. It's our largest known hibernacula. The fact that we didn't know if masks were going to be good enough made us pause and eventually just decide not to do it because it was too risky. Would I go into Azure today, knowing what we know? I could be convinced, particularly if we had the right personal protective gear. And so that's not the masks you wear at the grocery store. That's like adequately fitting masks, but even Azure, geez, you'd have to wear it for several hours. So, you know, wouldn't necessarily be the most fun trip. But I think if we had confidence in the masks that we were using. I'm less worried about transmission by touching things. It really is the respiratory droplets that made me nervous in terms of being in a closed cave environment. If you were in a cave that had lots of ventilation, I think it's certainly less risky. Again, you know, if you can wear a mask of some sort, I certainly think it would be a good idea.
I think everyone's going to need to start training at higher altitude if we're going to be caving with masks on. It's going to make us real tough. No, thank you so much for the presentation, Laura. I think this is wonderful, and you know, really appreciate you taking the time to update all of us. I had a question about decon. You mentioned that, you know, we should continue to decon like normal, and that seems, you know, like obviously the hope is that it would handle coronavirus the same way it handles the white nose syndrome fungus. Is there any evidence that decon protocols might change or need to be altered because of coronavirus?
There's been no talk of that within the white nose syndrome community. They've been basically saying, keep doing what you're doing. You know, they kind of reassess decontamination protocols every year as it is. So I can see them possibly looking at that right now, but to date, there's been no change. I think we're all kind of assuming that decon works so well for a fungus right now that it likely is doing the same for, or would do the same for a virus.
Awesome, thank you.
Any other questions? Do you think, Lauri, would it be possible to do another update if there's more information available? Do you think that would be like something next fall, or when would you anticipate that more information might be available?
Yeah, I failed to mention this. There are a lot of live animal trials underway right now. So I certainly hope by next fall, we will know that one way or another, if, you know, forcibly injecting bats with this virus has any impact. If the answer to that is no, they didn't even pick it up, or they picked it up but they appeared to be fine. I mean, it's a short-term study, at least what will get done this summer, but there's a lot of that work going on. And so I would hope that by this fall for sure, we would have some sort of update, and maybe it'll be a change in decon protocols. I would guess that they're going to continue to refine, you know, personal protective equipment, and particularly in light of the fact that the bat community knows that people go into caves in the winter, where I would guess bats could be a time when bats are super susceptible. I would guess that the community will be looking at that in advance so that they have new protocols to put out if any are appropriate. So yeah, we can do another one of these. We can do a recorded webinar or emails or whatever you want to do. And you are recording this, Ellen, or do you want me to send you my PowerPoint?
Yeah, I am recording this, so we can post that for everyone if you don't mind.
Perfect. Oh, it looks like Laura Beard from Wyoming is saying there are plans to do another risk assessment for winter work. Perfect.
Awesome. Well, if there are no other questions, we know where to find you, Lauri.
The opportunity, I appreciate it.
Yeah, thank you so much for being willing to take some time out of your busy schedule for this. I know we're all getting pretty Zoom meetinged out, but I thought it seems worth having this conversation.
Sure. It's good to see some of your faces on the screen. Take care, everybody.
Yep, thanks everyone,
Bye, everyone.
for tuning in.
Thanks, Lauri.